General Brennan didn't even look up from the financial reports, the fluorescent light catching the dust motes above his polished mahogany desk. His voice, a low rumble honed by years of demanding obedience, cut through the silence. Just leave it there, Lieutenant. Don't linger. I assumed these are the usual logistical redundancies. You wouldn't know the first thing about actual operational complexity at your age. Valdez stood perfectly straight, her dress uniform immaculate, betraying none of the internal turmoil that had been churning since the moment she accepted the administrative posting. She was here now, serving coffee, logging expenditures, and moving paper. She was the definition of desk duty, a label that felt like a deliberate, mocking scar. She placed the final authorization folder precisely on the designated marker, a small, silver square embossed with the general's personal crest. She presented the general's preferred writing instrument, a heavy, matte black Mont Blanc, the tip facing him, the action smooth and professional. He glanced at the pen, then at the folder, but not at her. Lieutenant, he sighed, the sound conveying the monumental inconvenience of being forced to acknowledge her presence. I appreciate the efficiency, but really, you young officers cycle through this office so quickly. It takes 6 months just to learn the difference between a requisition form and a casualty report. I doubt you've even been outside the green zone in your entire career. You are too young, Lieutenant. Far too young to have done anything real. The words struck with the familiar weight to the concussive blast, yet Valdez remained motionless, her expression a careful blank. She knew the protocol. Admirals and generals moved mountains, and the occasional collateral damage of a junior officer's morale was irrelevant to the grand strategic picture. She simply withdrew her hand, clasping her hands behind her back in the regulation parade rest, preparing to wait for his signature. The general's casual dismissal was the latest layer of sandbagging meant to protect the world from the uncomfortable truth of where she had actually been and what she had actually done. Her current assignment felt like a voluntary solitary confinement, a necessary penance required after the kind of catastrophic failure that leaves only ghosts behind. The air conditioning hummed, but the office's artificial chill was nothing compared to the humidity of the basin, the suffocating, primal heat that clung to every memory, every breath she took during those 32 days. 32 days. The mission, codenamed Chimera, was supposed to last 72 hours. It started, as all missions do, with an impossible briefing. FOB Chapman, tucked away in the forgotten corner of the Triple Frontier, was nothing more than a reinforced supply depot guarded by a handful of worn-out contractors and a rotating skeleton crew of special operations personnel. Valdez, then a surgeon first class, was their eyes. She wasn't supposed to be in the jungle. She was supposed to be above it, watching. Her specialty was extreme long-range interdiction, the kind of surgical shot that relied on physics as much as marksmanship. The target was a cartel kingpin known only as El Hueso, the Bone, who had shifted his base of operations deep into the maze of the Rio Negro tributaries, utilizing the dense canopy as an impenetrable shield for his synthetic drug production. Intelligence indicated Hueso would be attending a critical exposed rendezvous at a clearing carved out 50 kilometers from the established river routes. Valdez and her spotter, Sergeant Mark Davies, had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but calculations. The environment was the enemy. Temperature variances creating mirages, intense humidity increasing air density and altering projectile drag, and the insidious, constant effect of the Coriolis force, pulling the slug slightly eastward in the southern hemisphere as it traveled over a mile and a half of hostile airspace. Their primary tool was the Barrett M107A1 chambered in .50 BMG. Not elegant, but brutally effective. On the firing range back stateside, Valdez could hit a dinner plate at 2,000 meters blindfolded. Here, in the oppressive heat and unstable air, 1,800 meters felt like a blind shot into space. Davies, her partner for 5 years, was a master of the Kestrel ballistics calculator and an infuriatingly calm presence. Air density is still fluctuating, Val, he'd whispered, adjusting the tripod legs, sinking them slightly deeper into the mud. Giving you 6 degrees right wind drift, and we need to dial in another 4 clicks up for the drop, factoring the residual atmospheric pressure differential, plus your Coriolis correction. Valdez lay prone for 8 hours, breathing in slow, measured increments, attempting to suppress the erratic flutter of her own heart. The camouflage netting offered meager relief from the biting insects and the crushing weight of the sun. The only movement was the near imperceptible sway of the leaves and the slow, rhythmic beat of her blood in her ears. The target appeared exactly as predicted, stepping into the open clearing to shake hands with 2 heavily armed lieutenants. Valdez took 3 final breaths. In, out, in, out. The third breath was held. The world narrowed to the tiny intersection of crosshairs on the man's sternum. Her finger found the trigger, the pressure measured in grams, not force. Click. The shot should have sounded like the tearing of the sky,
A deep, resonant boom followed by the high-pitched crack of the bullet breaking the sound barrier. But the sound was swallowed by the jungle. The force slammed her shoulder back, a familiar, comforting violence. El Hueso dropped. Clean kill. Mission accomplished. But the moment the bullet impacted, the silence of the clearing did not last. Instead of scattering, the remaining enemy forces reacted with unnerving speed. They were waiting. They were prepared. Davies swore, low and sharp. Ambush. It was a setup, Val. They knew. We've got infantry inbound, 3 vectors. Valdez immediately shifted from the Barrett to her primary weapon, the HK-416, a modular beast she customized for jungle close-quarters engagement. But they were too exposed. The dense undergrowth that had offered concealment for their position now served as cover for the counterattackers. The ensuing firefight was chaos distilled. Tracers arced through the canopy, ripping holes in the air and the flesh of trees. Valdez poured controlled bursts into the advancing shadows. The roar of automatic fire was deafening, amplified by the humid air, turning the jungle into a meat grinder. They fought for 20 minutes. Davies was covering her flank, reloading his own 7.62mm rifle, when a burst of automatic fire ripped through the flimsy barrier of a decaying log. The sound was sickening, wet, and final. Valdez heard the air rush out of him before she heard the dull thud of his body hitting the sodden ground. Davies, she screamed, the name raw and useless. She crawled to him, ignoring the burning pain in her left leg, where a piece of shrapnel had torn through her uniform. Davies was still, his eyes wide and staring up through the canopy. His hand was clenched around a small, smooth river stone they had picked up together months ago as a joke. Valdez didn't have time to mourn. The enemy was closing in, their voices guttural and triumphant. She had one choice: extraction. But the primary extraction point was compromised. She grabbed Davies' rifle, his encrypted radio, and his personalized survival knife. She left the heavy, signature Barrett M107A1, too bulky, too loud, too impossible to carry while wounded and fleeing. It was a tactical abandonment that felt like sacrilege, leaving a piece of her soul buried in the mud alongside her partner. The next 32 days were a blur of primal survival. She was alone, isolated 50 kilometers behind enemy lines, navigating by the stars and the sound of the Rio Negro, which often sounded like 1,000 separate rivers flowing through her mind. The shrapnel wound festered quickly in the tropical climate. She ran out of clean water filters on day 10. She subsisted on scavenged insects, roots, and the rapidly dwindling supply of field rations. Her body became a machine of pain, each step an agonizing reminder of the trauma, the hunger, the constant suffocating fear of the hunters behind her. She developed jungle rot on her feet and hands, and the constant hum of mosquitoes carrying every conceivable disease became the soundtrack of her existence. Survival became a ritual of minimizing the self. She stopped thinking about home. She stopped thinking about the mission. She only focused on the next 3 meters. Clear the vine, avoid the snake, suppress the cough. She wore the same uniform, saturated with sweat, blood, and mud, until it stiffened and began to shred. Her radio remained dark. She couldn't risk transmission. She was a ghost. A legend whispered among the local tribes who occasionally saw a fleeting shadow. A woman covered in mud, moving with the preternatural silence of a hunted animal. On day 31, delirious with fever, dehydration, and exhaustion, she reached the river's edge. She saw the patrol boat, not ours, but a local military vessel, a potential enemy, but her body had ceased to care. She dragged herself onto the bank, collapsing into the mud. When the soldiers found her, they thought she was dead, a casualty of the river's merciless current. Her skin was gray, her muscles had atrophied, and she weighed 30 pounds less than when she started. But on her right index finger, she wore the ring. It wasn't standard issue. It was crude, forged from the melted down brass casings of the ammunition she and Davies had fired together over years of training and deployment. They had designed them together.
A morbid joke about embracing the inevitable. They called it the Reaper Ring, a grim reminder that their profession meant dancing with the grave, and they had to be willing to lead the dance. Davies wore his, Valdez wore hers. After the ambush, when she had stabilized enough in the field hospital to think clearly, she took Davies' ring, the one forged from the same brass batch, and had it fused into hers, creating a double-banded, asymmetrical circle of dark metal. It was heavy,
perpetually cold and slightly abrasive against her skin. It was the only grave marker he had. It was a promise, a burden, and the absolute physical proof that she hadn't just handled paperwork. She had spent 3 months in rehabilitation, fighting off multiple tropical infections, and another 3 months undergoing mandatory psychological review. The system, efficient and brutal, recognized her survival not as heroism, but as a liability. She had seen too much, lost too much, and carried the weight of a mission failure that was now classified as a successful intelligence-gathering operation, thanks to a carefully redacted report. The official finding was simple. Sergeant First Class Valdez needed a change of pace. She was reassigned to the administrative detachment at the general's headquarters, ostensibly for her exemplary organizational skills, but in reality to keep her quiet, contained, and safely away from anything resembling a combat zone. Now she was Lieutenant Valdez, the efficient clerk who knew how to log a requisition slip for a new stapler. General Brennan finally picked up the pen, his eyes still fixed on the logistics report detailing the fuel costs for a recent transport run. He began to initial the document, his signature a practiced scrawl. "You know, Lieutenant," he said, still preoccupied, "this office is a high-pressure environment. We deal with real consequences here, millions of taxpayer dollars, strategic resource allocation. It takes maturity to grasp the gravity of this responsibility. I'm just saying, your generation tends to think that running simulations in a nice climate-controlled classroom counts as experience. It doesn't." He paused, lowering the Mont Blanc for a moment, frowning at the thickness of the administrative folder. He tapped the pen impatiently, then stretched his hand out, resting it on the edge of the mahogany. And that was the precise moment the sterile, predictable world of the headquarters office cracked. His eyes fell upon her right hand, where it rested quietly near the folder. Specifically, his gaze locked onto the finger supporting the heavy, matte black ring. It was not a standard issue ring. It wasn't a wedding band or a class ring. It was rough, unfinished, slightly pitted metal, thick and aggressive, bearing the unmistakable, unique oxidation of spent artillery brass. It was utterly devoid of ornamentation, save for the distinct double weld line where one band had been brutally, hastily attached to the other. The general froze. Brennan was a strategist, a man who moved armies on maps. But before the stars, before the polished desk, he had been a forward observer, a man who understood symbols and the terrible, unspoken language of the field. He recognized the shape immediately. It was the unofficial, self-made marker of certain isolated deep recon units, the morbid joke, the ultimate dedication, the Reaper ring. His breath hitched, a sound too sharp for the silence of the room. The casual contempt evaporated from his expression, replaced by a deep, terrifying coldness that originated somewhere far away and long ago. His eyes, seconds before dismissive, were now intensely focused, burning with recognition. He looked up at Valdez for the first time, really looked at her. He saw past the immaculate uniform, past the perfect posture, and into the profound exhaustion etched around her eyes. He saw the stillness that was not discipline, but a careful suppression of trauma. "That ring," General Brennan said, his voice flat, stripped of all rank and authority. It was merely the sound of a man who suddenly feared what he was about to confirm. Valdez did not flinch. She maintained parade rest, her eyes fixed on a point just above his left shoulder, as if reciting a regulation from a manual. "It was forged, General, a personal marker." "No," Brennan insisted, leaning forward, his heavy frame momentarily forgetting the reports. "I know that design. I know the material. We used to joke about them in the old days. That's the brass, isn't it? The heavy caliber. Not just a token. That's a unit ring. A Reaper. Tell me where did you acquire that?" The gravity of the general's demand was not in the volume, but in the sudden intimacy of his tone. He was no longer her superior. He was a relic staring at a ghost. Valdez finally lowered her gaze to meet his, and in her eyes, General Brennan saw the humid hell she carried. "Rio Negro, sir," she stated simply, the name a cold syllable in the heated office. "The upper basin. Ambush extraction. 32 days. The general's face went instantly pale, the color draining away as if pulled by an invisible tide. The logistics reports, the fuel costs, the demands of the modern military all dissolved, replaced by the choking scent of mud and cordite. Rio Negro. Brennan knew the official report. He had signed off on the classified summary months ago. Successful target neutralization, minimal friendly contact, 2 MIAs assumed killed by local insurgents during routine patrol. A sanitization so effective it barely registered on the command radar. But the general knew the history. He knew about the operations that went dark, the missions that disappeared into the crushing complexity of the Triple Frontier. And he knew that the only people who wore the Reaper ring in that specific heavy brass configuration were the ones who carried the big guns, the lonely operators, the ghosts. If she was wearing one that was fused, a double bond, it meant she had carried 2 burdens out of the darkness. The unit, General Brennan whispered, his lips barely moving. Davies. Sergeant Davies was attached to that mission. He was reported lost. He was my spotter, sir, Valdez confirmed. Her voice was steady, betraying no emotion, as if delivering the coordinates of a known threat. We went dark 1,800 meters out. We were overwhelmed. I retrieved what I could. The brass casings of his final clips were among them. The ring is his and mine, fused together. Brennan slumped back into his chair, the leather squeaking in protest. The weight of the moment was crushing. He had just casually insulted a woman who had walked out of hell, who had carried the physical manifestation of her fallen comrade on her hand, a burden far heavier than any logistics folder. He had dismissed her service as too young to have done anything real. The silence stretched, thick and painful, measuring the distance between their polished world and the deadly reality of the jungle. The general reached up slowly, his hand moving with a deliberation that suggested severe mental exhaustion. He reached not for the phone or the folder, but for the knot of his uniform jacket. His fingers, thick and slightly trembling, found the pin of his most prized decoration, the star. Not the simple commendation ribbon, but the actual heavy metal of the Bronze Star for valor, earned decades ago in a desperate firefight he rarely spoke about, a moment of sheer, terrifying courage that had defined the trajectory of his entire career. He unclipped the metal. The small metallic sound of the clasp releasing echoed in the quiet office, sharp and intrusive. The metal itself was solid, polished bronze, tethered to a tight crimson and white ribbon. He didn't look at the metal. He looked only at Valdez. He saw not the administrative lieutenant, but the exhausted survivor who had honored her dead in the most brutal way possible. He saw the true cost of operational complexity. With a deep, shuddering intake of air, General Brennan pushed the folder aside, ignoring the important documents scattered beneath his fingertips. He held the Bronze Star out, not as an award, but as an offering, a profound apology that words could never convey. His hand, which had signed orders sending men and women into harm's way for 30 years, shook slightly as he offered the medal across the desk. Lieutenant Valdez, his voice cracked, raw with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel since his own earliest days in combat. I cannot possibly comprehend the 32 days you spent in that black water, but I understand the ring. It is the proof. You did not just survive, Lieutenant. You honored the dead and defied the odds. You paid the dead. He pushed the metal filly across the mahogany surface until it rested against the fingertips of her left hand, the hand that was not adorned by the Reaper. Take this. It's not paperwork. It's the highest recognition of the highest price. It is what you are owed, and I am profoundly sorry for every word I just uttered. You are not too young, Lieutenant. You are a survivor, and you are real. Valdez looked down at the Bronze Star. The metal was cool against her skin, heavy and ornate, a stark contrast to the crude simplicity of the brass ring she wore for mourning. She knew she couldn't accept it officially. The paperwork would be a nightmare, the inquiry worse. But this was not an official transaction. This was the exchange of 2 veterans across the vast chasm of rank, united by the terrible knowledge of absolute loss. She simply nodded once, a brief,
sharp movement of affirmation. She picked up the metal, her fingers closing around the cold bronze. She did not salute. She merely placed the metal gently inside the breast pocket of her uniform, securing it close to her heart, the fabric muffling the clink of metal against metal. General Brennan remained slumped in his chair, utterly defeated by the revelation. His face was a mask of moral exhaustion, the starch of his authority completely gone. He watched the young lieutenant, now elevated far above his own rank by the depth of her experience, turn on her heel and execute a silent, precise about-face. She had come in to manage paperwork. She left having signed her own worth in blood and validated her history in silence. Brennan sat alone in the humming office, staring at the empty space on his uniform where the metal had rested for 20 years, and felt for the first time in a long time, truly young and profoundly unworthy. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.